32 kilometers. That is the narrowest navigable width of the most strategically consequential waterway on Earth. Through this corridor flows nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply, a volume so concentrated that any disruption would ripple instantly through every major economy. And this video will show you that the future balance of global power will not be decided across continents or in capitals, but inside this single strip of water. For decades, analysts have framed control of this corridor in military terms: fleets, missiles, deterrence, and escalation. That framing is no longer sufficient. What appears to be a question of naval dominance is, in reality, a question of systemic control. Because the power to influence this passage is no longer defined solely by who can close it, but by who can shape the conditions under which it remains open. I am a geopolitical and financial systems analyst. I have spent years studying energy choke points, maritime strategy, and the financial architecture that governs global trade. In the next 25 minutes, I will show you three things that are rarely examined together. First, the precise geographic and logistical reality of this 32-kilometer corridor, and why its physical constraints make it uniquely vulnerable in ways most maps fail to capture. Second, the hidden structural weaknesses inside the current system that is supposed to keep it stable, including the economic and political dependencies that are quietly eroding that stability. And third, the emerging mechanism of control that does not rely on ships or weapons at all, but on something far less visible and far more decisive. Because once you understand that mechanism, the entire narrative surrounding this waterway begins to shift. It stops being a story about potential disruption and becomes a story about controlled dependency. And once dependency replaces deterrence, the question is no longer who can shut this corridor down, but who ultimately decides how the world is allowed to use it. If you believe this kind of analysis matters, not as speculation, but as a way to understand how global power actually functions beneath the surface, then you already recognize why this conversation is different. The people watching this channel are not looking for comfort. They are looking for clarity before the conclusions become obvious, before the narrative is simplified and distributed after the fact. This video is not an isolated discussion. It connects to a broader body of work examining how energy choke points, financial systems, and geopolitical strategy intersect to shape outcomes that appear, on the surface, to be driven by conflict alone. There is a reason a separate analysis on how financial architecture quietly controls global trade is becoming increasingly relevant to what we are about to explore. For those who want to understand these dynamics early, to see structure where others see chaos, you are part of a smaller audience that values foresight over reaction. Because once you understand what really governs this 32-kilometer corridor, the question is no longer whether it matters, but who is actually in control of it. 32 kilometers. That is the narrowest navigable width of the Strait of Hormuz, the thin strip of water through which nearly one-fifth of the world's oil supply must pass every single day. It is not a vast ocean. It is not an abstract concept. It is a choke point so tight, so exposed, that any disruption, military, political, or financial, reverberates instantly across global markets. And tonight, I will argue that control over those 32 kilometers is no longer determined by ships or missiles alone, but by a deeper system that is already reshaping who truly holds power over global energy flows. I am Professor Alex Watkin. I have spent the past 2 decades studying the intersection of geopolitical strategy, energy systems, and financial architecture. In the next 30 minutes, I will show you 3 things that most analysis ignores. First, the physical reality of the Strait of Hormuz, its geography, constraints, and why its importance has been misunderstood for decades. Second, the structural fractures within the traditional power systems that have governed this corridor, fractures that are now reaching a breaking point. And third, the emergence of a new, largely invisible force, one that does not rely on fleets or blockades, but on something far more difficult to confront and far more decisive in the long term. Because the central question is no longer who can close the strait, it is who can make its closure irrelevant. To understand that shift, we have to begin not with politics but with geography. Because in this part of the world, geography is not just destiny, it is leverage, constraint, and, increasingly, vulnerability. Let me leave you with my prediction, stated plainly, so there is no ambiguity about what I am saying. Within the next 15 years, Iran will not lose relevance in the Strait of Hormuz, but it will lose exclusivity. Its ability to threaten disruption will remain intact, yet its leverage will diminish as alternative corridors, pipelines, and financial routing systems reduce global dependence on that narrow channel. Control will no longer mean the ability to block passage, but the ability to bypass it. Iran will still matter, but it will no longer decide outcomes. The United States and its Western allies will not disappear from the region, but their role will become increasingly reactive rather than directive. Naval presence will persist, alliances will endure, but the structural foundations of control, currency dominance, insurance markets, and settlement systems will face gradual erosion. Influence will remain visible, but authority will become conditional. Power will still be projected, but it will no longer be decisive. Regional powers, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, will accelerate their pivot toward diversification, building overland energy routes and embedding themselves within new financial and logistical networks. Their strategy will not be confrontation, but insulation. They will reduce exposure to choke points rather than compete for them. Geography will still define them, but it will no longer constrain them. And the emerging force, the one that will ultimately determine the future of this corridor, is not a navy or a nation. It is a financial and logistical architecture built on settlement systems, long-term contracts, and infrastructure integration, increasingly shaped by China and its partners. This system will not close the strait, it will make its closure strategically irrelevant. The system will not dominate through force, it will dominate through dependency. I want to be honest with you about what this means. Those who believe in the continuity of liberal, rules-based systems will find this transition deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that power is shifting away from transparent institutions toward more opaque, state-linked networks. The predictability that once defined global trade may give way to layered dependencies that are harder to see and harder to challenge. Those who prioritize national sovereignty and regional autonomy will see a different picture, one where states are no longer trapped by geography alone, but are instead able to reconfigure their strategic position through infrastructure and alignment. But this autonomy comes at a cost, because dependence does not disappear. It simply changes form. And those who are focused on economic access and financial stability will find themselves navigating a world where the routes that matter are no longer just physical, but systemic. Access to energy will increasingly depend not only on supply, but on participation in the networks that move and settle that supply. The world is not moving toward a more familiar version of the same old order. It is moving toward something genuinely new. 32 kilometers. A narrow strip of water, seemingly insignificant in isolation, yet burdened with decades of geopolitical weight. For generations, it has been treated as a valve, something that could be opened or closed, controlled or contested. But what we have uncovered is that its true significance is shifting. It is no longer just a choke point. It is a test case for a broader transformation, where physical control is gradually stooped to systemic influence. Those 32 kilometers will still exist, ships will still pass through them, but the power they represent will no longer reside in the water itself. It will reside in the systems that decide whether that water still matters. If you stayed until this point, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. This is not content designed for comfort. It is built for those who want to understand the structures shaping the world before they become obvious. Tell me in the comments, which scenario do you believe is most likely, and why? I read every response. The next analysis will go somewhere most channels will not, into a system that quietly underpins everything we think we understand about global power. Stay curious, stay informed, question everything, especially the analysis that tells you the answer is simple.